When an airplane falls out of the sky, it is almost always a spectacle. A mechanical failure, a mid-air explosion, a sudden drop from 30,000 feet. But the absolute deadliest disaster in the entire history of commercial aviation did not happen in the sky. It happened on the ground. It began not with an engineering flaw, but with a terrorist bomb in a crowded terminal. It escalated due to a sudden suffocating shift in the weather. And it climaxed because of the sheer, unbridled arrogance of one of the most famous pilots in the world. On March 27, 1977, on a tiny island off the coast of Africa, two massive Boeing 747 jumbos carrying nearly 600 people found themselves trapped on the exact same strip of asphalt, separated by thousands of feet of impenetrable fog, unable to see each other and unable to see the control tower. What happened next fundamentally shattered the aviation industry. This is not just a story about two planes colliding. This is a terrifying psychological breakdown of how ego, hierarchy, and a cascade of tiny, seemingly harmless miscommunications killed 583 people in a matter of seconds. To understand how the deadliest crash in history unfolded, you have to understand the terrifying concept of the Swiss cheese model of disaster. A massive catastrophe rarely happens because of one single error. It happens when multiple independent failures align perfectly, like the holes in slices of Swiss cheese. If even one of those holes doesn't line up, the disaster is averted. And on this Sunday in 1977, the first hole was punched by a terrorist group. At 1:15 p.m., a bomb planted by a separatist group exploded in the passenger terminal of Las Palmas Airport on the island of Gran Canaria. The blast injured 8 people and shattered the terminal windows. 15 minutes later, the terrorists called the police and warned that a second bomb was hidden somewhere in the airport. The authorities had no choice. They immediately closed Las Palmas Airport to all incoming traffic. This single decision threw the entire transatlantic airspace into absolute chaos. Dozens of massive commercial airliners descending toward the Canary Islands, packed with thousands of European and American tourists, were suddenly ordered to divert to an alternate airport. Air traffic control scrambled to find a place to put these massive jets. They ordered them to land at Los Rodeos Airport on the neighboring island of Tenerife. But Los Rodeos was not an international hub. It was a tiny regional airport situated high up in a volcanic mountain basin. It had only one runway, one single taxiway, and 0 ground radar. The air traffic controllers working in the tiny tower were completely unequipped to handle jumbo jets. Within an hour, Los Rodeos became a claustrophobic parking lot. The tiny apron was so crammed with diverted aircraft that planes were forced to park directly on the main taxiway itself, meaning that if a plane wanted to take off, it couldn't use the taxiway. It would have to drive slowly down the actual runway, turn around 180 degrees at the very end, and take off in the opposite direction. Among the planes trapped in this chaotic, congested bottleneck were 2 massive Boeing 747s. One was Pan Am Flight 1736, carrying 380 American tourists from Los Angeles. The other was KLM Flight 4805, carrying 234 Dutch passengers from Amsterdam. The passengers were exhausted, frustrated, and stuck inside their planes in the blazing island heat. But no one was more frustrated than the captain of the KLM flight, Jacob Veldhuyzen van Zanten. And Captain Van Zanten was not just a normal pilot. He was the absolute pride of the Dutch aviation empire. He was the chief flight instructor for KLM. His face was literally printed on KLM's magazine advertisements around the world. He was a god among pilots. And as the hours ticked by on this tiny island, Captain Van Zanten's legendary ego began to unravel, setting the stage for the apocalypse. To understand why Captain Van Zanten was so desperate to leave Tenerife, you have to understand the strict aviation labor laws of the 1970s. The Dutch government had recently passed incredibly rigid duty time regulations. If a flight crew exceeded their maximum working hours, they would face severe legal penalties and their airline would be heavily fined. Van Zanten was doing the math in his head. If they were stuck on this tiny island for much longer, his crew would legally time out. They would be forced to cancel the flight, put 234 angry passengers in hotels that didn't exist, and completely humiliate KLM. Van Zanten refused to let that happen. He was the chief instructor. He was the face of the airline. He needed to get his plane back in the air the exact second the airport in Gran Canaria reopened. After a few agonizing hours, the radio crackled to life. The bomb threat at Gran Canaria was a hoax. The main airport was finally open again. The Pan Am crew was overjoyed. They were parked right behind the KLM plane, and they immediately radioed the tower for permission to start their engines and taxi to the runway. But they quickly realized they were trapped. Captain Van Zanten, in a frantic bid to save time later, had decided to fully refuel his massive 747 right there on the apron. The Pan Am pilots were furious. They were blocked in by the Dutch Titan and its fuel trucks. The Pan Am first officer even climbed down out of the cockpit and physically walked around the KLM plane to see if they could squeeze past the wing, but there wasn't enough room. The Americans were forced to sit and wait for over a grueling hour while the Dutch pumped thousands of gallons of highly flammable jet fuel into their wings. That decision to refuel was the second hole in the Swiss cheese. Because while the KLM plane sat there absorbing fuel, the weather in the volcanic basin began to change rapidly. Tenerife is famous for its unpredictable microclimates. A massive dense cloud of sea fog rolled down the side of the volcano and completely swallowed Los Rodeos Airport. Within minutes, visibility dropped from several miles to less than 1,000 feet. It dropped so fast and became so thick that the air traffic controllers sitting high up in the tower could no longer see the runway. They could no longer see the taxiway. And remember, this tiny regional airport did not have ground radar. The controllers were entirely blind. They had to rely solely on the radio to know where these massive airplanes were. The KLM plane finally finished refueling. The controllers ordered Captain Van Zanten to taxi his massive 747 directly down the main runway, turn around 180 degrees at the far end, and hold his position. The Pan Am 747 was ordered to follow right behind them on the same runway, but they were instructed to turn off at the third exit to get out of the way. It was an incredibly dangerous maneuver, two giant planes driving on an active runway in blinding fog, completely invisible to the tower and to each other. In the KLM cockpit, Captain Van Zanten reached the end of the runway, spun his massive 747 around, and faced the thick wall of gray fog. He throttled up the engines, the sound roaring through the cabin. He was ready to fly. But he didn't have clearance for takeoff. The KLM first officer, a younger man whom Van Zanten had personally trained, nervously reminded the captain that they only had ATC clearance for their flight route, but not the actual clearance to take off down the runway. Van Zanten snapped at him, furious at the delay. The first officer hastily keyed his microphone and told the tower, "We are now at takeoff." The controller in the tower, heavily accented and confused, replied, "Okay, stand by for takeoff. I will call you." But a fatal technological glitch occurred. At that exact microsecond, the Pan Am pilots also keyed their microphone to say, "We are still taxiing down the runway." Because both planes transmitted on the exact same frequency at the exact same time, the radio waves canceled each other out. In the KLM cockpit, instead of hearing "stand by for takeoff" or "we are still on the runway," all Captain Van Zanten heard was a screeching 3-second burst of static. His ego took over. He assumed they were cleared. He pushed the 4 massive throttles entirely forward. The fully loaded, highly explosive KLM 747 began barreling down the runway into the blind fog. Further down the runway, hidden entirely by the impenetrable fog, the American Pan Am 747 was still slowly driving forward, trying desperately to find the third exit in the blinding mist. The Pan Am pilots were tense. They were driving a massive metal building down an active runway. In the cockpit voice recorder, the Pan Am captain, Victor Grubbs, can be heard saying, "Let's get the hell out of here!" Suddenly, through the thick gray wall of fog, a bright light appeared. It looked like a star. Then, it split into two rapidly approaching landing lights. The Pan Am crew froze in absolute terror. The KLM 747 was charging directly at them at 160 miles per hour. Captain Grubbs screamed, "There he is! Look at him! That son of a bitch is coming!" He jammed the throttles entirely forward and desperately tried to steer his massive 747 off the runway and into the grass. In the KLM cockpit, Captain Van Zanten saw the silhouette of the Pan Am jet emerge from the fog. He realized with absolute horror what he had done. He pulled back on the yoke with all of his might, trying to lift his fully loaded, incredibly heavy airplane into the sky over the Americans. The tail of the KLM jet slammed into the asphalt, dragging for nearly 70 feet and throwing massive sparks into the air as Van Zanten desperately tried to force the plane into the air. He almost made it. But because of his arrogant decision to fully refuel his plane earlier on the apron, the KLM jet was too heavy to climb. At 160 miles per hour, the landing gear and engines of the KLM 747 violently sliced through the upper deck of the Pan Am jet, instantly obliterating the American plane's roof. The KLM plane stayed in the air for another 500 feet before stalling, slamming back down onto the runway and sliding for 1,000 feet. Because it was completely full of jet fuel, the KLM plane instantly erupted into a massive, unsurvivable fireball. Everyone on board the Dutch flight was incinerated. On the Pan Am flight, the impact and the resulting fire killed 335 people. In total, 583 human beings died in a matter of seconds. The rescue effort was chaotic and horrifying, hampered by the fact that the fog was still so thick that firefighters couldn't even find the wreckage of the KLM plane for several minutes. When the sun finally rose the next morning, the global aviation industry stared at the smoldering, twisted metal on the runway in absolute disbelief. How could the two most advanced airplanes in the world, commanded by elite pilots, collide on the ground? The investigation that followed pointed squarely at a terrifying concept that airlines had ignored for decades: the absolute authority of the captain. In the 1970s, the aviation culture was highly militarized. The captain was a god. If the captain made a decision, the first officer and flight engineer were explicitly trained never to question it. The investigation revealed that the KLM flight engineer had actually expressed doubt right before they took off, asking Captain Van Zanten, "Is he not clear, that Pan American?" But because Van Zanten arrogantly dismissed him, the younger engineer immediately backed down and stayed silent. The Tenerife disaster forced the entire global airline industry to fundamentally change human psychology. They invented a concept called crew resource management. It completely destroyed the dictatorship of the cockpit. Today, first officers are strictly trained and required to aggressively challenge the captain if they see a mistake, no matter how famous or experienced that captain is. The Tenerife Airport Disaster remains the deadliest accident in aviation history. It proves that no matter how advanced the engineering of an airplane becomes, the most dangerous component on board will always be the human ego. If you want to see how engineering hubris destroyed Britain's first jet airliner, click the video on screen now. Subscribe to Altitude Zero for more incredible stories from the history of aviation.